I'm Evan Feigenbaum, the Vice President for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And this is one chapter in a multi-part video series on 6 crises and how the United States and China, despite their very deep strategic rivalry, nonetheless managed to coordinate. This time we're talking to Jack Chow, who in the first term of the Bush administration was the point person for the United States in negotiating on global public health. And in particular, he was the point person on negotiating the global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, which today dispenses $4 billion around the world to fight these diseases, 93% of which comes from donor governments. And one of those governments, in addition to the United States, is China. There are 3 things that are interesting about the Chinese role in that. First, when the negotiations began in 2001, it was one of the lowest points between those 2 countries. There had just been a collision between a Chinese fighter jet and an American EP-3 aircraft. Second, although we think of China as a global power today, we tended not to think of China that way in the early 2000s. So this was one of the first instances of China stepping up in a global context and donating money to a global fund, although China subsequently also became a big recipient from the fund. Third, this is an area of global public health, something that's especially relevant today as the world deals with the pandemic of the coronavirus known as COVID-19. So we asked Jack Chow to reflect on that experience. What had worked between the United States and China and what hadn't, what was hard, what was easy, and in particular, what lessons he draws from that experience that might be relevant for policymakers and bureaucrats and medical professionals today. Here's what he told us.
China has had a long history of appreciation for natural herb remedies through the millennia, and that interest continued through the modern era. As you point out, scientists were looking at a number of botanicals for therapeutic uses outside of traditional Chinese medicine. Artemisinin is one such compound, and the Chinese worked very diligently at different combinations. And through a stroke of luck, they came up with lumefantrin and artemisinin as a very potent treatment against falciparum malaria, the type of malaria that is the big killer in Africa. So in that era, China became a player in malaria, in addition to Vietnam, because they did the research, they recognized the application of this medicine, and they physically grew a lot of these plants. And later on, when WHO, my team, declared artemisinin combination therapy to be the standard therapy, the wholesale price of the raw material skyrocketed. And we spent much time engaging China from WHO to find ways to increase supply and bring the cost lower through diversification and market modifications. So that is another contributory avenue that China played through the history of the Global Fund, which is to help secure the supply of this vital medicine to those that need it. The state of play, as I became engaged heavily in the Global Fund negotiations, is that we in the Science Bureau at State were very cognizant of some of the major work streams between the United States and China at the time. Most significantly was China's accession to the World Trade Organization and the hurdles that China had to go through in order to formally access the WTO. We at the Science Bureau noted that the negotiations were quite pragmatic, checking the box. And as I started to work on the Global Fund and the Chinese representative, Dr. Ren, that spirit of pragmatism came through. There was no ideological debate as to whether one country had an edge over another. It was really focused on developing the architecture of the fund, the constitution of the fund, and the operational objectives of those negotiations were very tangible, which is, who would be the bank of the global fund, who would be who would have voting power on the board, what would be the role of the NGOs. And as we ticked through all the major operational objectives in designing the architecture of the global fund, the Chinese delegation was very forthright, very cooperative, and I do not recall any major objections being raised to the framework that we, the United States, was putting forth in consultation with the other negotiating partners. So I believe that the pragmatic streak that one might think started back with Deng Xiaoping carried on through through the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao period, and it worked to the benefit in creating the Global Fund. The strategic goal of the Global Fund was to act as a funding mechanism to tangible supply streams of medicines, HIV, antiretrovirals, mosquito bed nets, the combination therapy, tuberculosis treatments. And because of that, it really crystallized the negotiations to very concrete issues. And it boiled down the questions to pretty much binary yes, no type of options. And I did not detect at that time the Chinese refracting any of the ideological or rivalry into the negotiations. And when we talked about the meaning of the Global Fund broadly as a new multilateral institution, the principles that we enunciated in the Global Fund framework and constitution were supported by the Chinese, which is remarkable because the architecture of the Global Fund has a very distinguished feature, which is giving the private sector and the NGOs and the philanthropic groups real voting power on the board. Given one's projected thinking about how China views the private sector and NGOs, there's at least acquiescence, if one might call it that, or even tacit support of this architecture, I think reflects well on China seeing the Global Fund as a novel instrument confronting a rising threat of HIV/AIDS, and potentially helps China view themselves as being more progressive on these issues. Negotiations for the Global Fund were very intensive. They started right after 9/11, and we had a diplomatic tailwind where the world was very empathic and sympathetic to the United States taking on the war on terror. And our teams worked for the next 4 months very intensively in Brussels and then in Geneva. Some of the key issues are the makeup of the board, who had the voting power, how would the money be mobilized and distributed, and how could we account for how the program operated. And looking back, I don't think any of those issues were easy, but some of the things that crystallized more rapidly than others. But there was some commonalities, one which is a consensus that the World Bank should play a major role in the fund operations by being a trusted organization that could be hold on to the money and disperse the money in ways that the fund board would be comfortable with. One contentious area was the designation of a inspector general function. And one would think that this should be straightforward and easy, but there was also an underlying concern that an overly aggressive inspector general overseeing the global fund, working within the global fund, could actually hamper operations if investigations were to be pursued to the nth degree. So we encountered surprisingly pushback to some of the American proposals to create an aggressive inspector general. As the global fund began to operate, it works on a grant disbursement basis. Country committees would review applications from NGOs and governments and make a formal request to the board, and the board would basically rank order these applications and design the disbursement schedule. Over time, and I wrote about this in Foreign Policy, it was discovered that China began withdrawing more money from the global fund than several dozen African countries put together. And later, when I had left the government by then, and I looked at the annual reports of the global fund and saw the ranking of disbursements, I was very surprised and concerned that China was basically subtracting money that otherwise would have gone to very needy African and poverty-stricken countries. So I wrote that article to shed light on it, and that had a shock effect on the global fund community that revealed this dynamic. And to make a long story short, China began to turn off taking money from the fund, and over time had become a contributor. So one might think that their cooperation in making the global fund happen could have had, they could have had a long-term intention to see the global fund as supplementary to their own domestic health needs. The other country that comes to mind that could be in the same situation as China was Russia. Russia at the time played a supportive role, not as strong as China in global fund negotiations, but they too, being a large country and very heavy HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis arcs, also drew money from the global fund. But Putin actually reversed course on policy and actually made a major donation to the fund in the midlife of the fund's disbursement history. They didn't draw as much money, to my knowledge, as much as China did in that block of time of 2003 to 2013. One might look at the World Bank portfolio of loans and examine how much China has accessed World Bank lending facilities. I don't specifically have the information on the tip of my finger, but that might be one area in which China made use of multilateral organizations in order to derive a benefit. One thing I did note in the global fund history is that China, while being a rising power, they insisted on being classified as a developing country rather than an industrialized, developed country. And at that time, I thought that was a very clever self-designation because it basically, number one, put them in alignment with the other developing countries, the sub-Saharan African countries, the Caribbean countries that had that were poor, very poor per capita, but not to the but certainly China was in a different category by itself, just being a centralized power and having an ability, a much bigger throw weight in diplomatic affairs than these other countries. So the casting of themselves as developing played a role in allowing them diplomatic support to these other countries, while also allowing them entree to the benefits of these new organizations. Lessons that I derived from negotiating the Global Fund with the international partners, including China, is that if there's an overarching challenge, and a disease like HIV/AIDS, arguably in that time, was a top priority, being able to create a mechanism with a pragmatic outcome, the distribution of medicines, seems to coalesce partners to focus on what is real versus bickering over ideological or political preferences. And during those negotiations, I always focused our talking points on accomplishing the next operational objective and asking the partners who might be able to contribute or trade to achieve those objectives. It was never my negotiating strategy to put political pressure or project an ideological preference on any of our partners. And that was a point that I took, whether it was the Scandinavian countries or the tier of African countries or China. We were laser focused on creating a operational mechanism with clear outcomes. And every now and then there would be a flashpoint issue as the Global Fund came into being, such as the distribution of condoms and other social flashpoints. But by and large, that focus on concrete outcomes, to me, was a striking feature of that time. Lessons for today that are applicable to the COVID-19 pandemic is that the world shares a common sphere, and we share a common humanity that national leaders as well as homeless people can become infected and suffer greatly. And the fact that the virus originated physically in Wuhan, China, speaks to, and the rapidity in which it spread around the world, speaks to the need of what I call a global health defense network, that we have a common interest to defeating the propagation of the virus. And the world is so interlaced, particularly US and China, through trade and culture nowadays, that cooperation is a vital link. And the fact that it spread rapidly from China to Europe and to the United States speaks volumes about how cooperation did not happen in a way that influenced the public health course of this epidemic. So I would point to the Global Fund as being a shining moment in time where all countries, rivals or competitors or allies, coalesced in creating one unified public health organization that survives today and thrives today. So going forward, I hope that the Global Fund, the global health architecture, will be transformed by the common experience of China, the United States, and the other world powers to come together and find a way to create a what I call a medical NATO, an alliance that takes global health to the highest level, which is surveillance connected to implementation, that we have an ability to deploy doctors, supplies, hospital ships even, to faraway regions to put out epidemics where they originate. Because if we allow epidemics to originate and nobody does anything, we see that entire regions are consumed. Back in the Bush administration, through Obama, multilateralism was the common currency of diplomacy. When we think about climate change, when we think about human rights, it was almost reflexive back then to want to work through international organizations. Today, that reflex has been extinguished, and that has bled into fighting this pandemic. When countries basically reacted to the propagation of COVID-19 as sort of like hermit crabs, just all squirting back into their own little shell, each little shell, but nobody has come out to knit a common defense. That is what is striking to me, that there was no major coordination among countries to shut off the transmission links. It was pretty much what I call done by what I call a checkerboard style of policymaking, where you have strong countries like the United States that have the resources to implement its preferred policies, but weak countries with fragile health systems, such as sub-Saharan Africa, are basically laid bare. They effectively can offer no defense against the virus. And you have China, which, because of its authoritarian style of governance, was able to bring the caseload rate down dramatically, and now is able to restart their economy. Yet it seems to me that they have not shown any empathy or real reflection on how the epidemic originated within Wuhan and has become the most ominous threat to human health in our generation. So it's striking to me that China hasn't really expressed a humanitarian impulse to the degree that we in the Western cultures typically express. From State Department, health was seen pretty much as a soft power issue, sort of an issue where the technicians, the doctors, and the epidemiologists were entrusted with the solution. That began to change with the Ebola outbreak, when the virus began to spread across Western Africa and even leapfrog into the United States and Europe. There was a recognition that fighting an epidemic of that lethality wasn't just the province of doctors. It entailed political will, it entailed economic expenditures, and it entailed social mobilization to change people's behavior. Fast forward to COVID, that now an epidemic like COVID is seen more in a hard power lens, when you have a vice president involved, when you have financial markets swooning, when you have extensive disruption of societal life. I believe the outcome of COVID is that public health and fighting disease is a rising hard power issue. And if that lens is adopted, then US-China cooperation should flow from that. because we both have a self-interest to protect the population security of our people. And we also have the traditional hard power issues of protecting military strength and protecting economies from the devastating impact of this pandemic. So if that interest, that common interest, that global interest between US and China, that we have to protect the world against future pandemics, then the agenda going forward ought to be very clear. It's an upgrade, a strengthening of the World Health Organization. It is creating a new health architecture that combines surveillance with response and implementation. And that's and it also entails more support for countries and regions with fragile health systems, because the epidemic, COVID, if it were to entrench itself in the developing world, may become a perpetual pandemic rather than an episodic pandemic. And that would be devastating to everybody. It was almost a magical time to negotiate the Global Fund. You think about the staying power of the Global Fund. It's distributed, I think, $30 billion worth of medical supplies over almost 20 years. There are very few multilateral organizations that I can think of which has been universally supported by peoples and countries. And it could actually be the vehicle to transform global health if you expand the mission of the Global Fund to include biological defense and pandemic preparedness. What we did back then is the foundation for future cooperation, I hope.